Beloved audience, how would you respond if someone pleaded with you to jeopardize all your achievements to assist them? Today's narrative concerns a young Texas policewoman whose life was completely transformed when she received an extraordinary plea from within prison walls. This tale goes beyond simply breaking regulations or crossing boundaries. It centers on a decision that would challenge her core beliefs and change two lives in unimaginable ways. Before we explore this remarkable story deeply, I need you to understand that what follows will question your views on justice, truth, and one person's power to act righteously. If such stories inspire you, please click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share in the comments where you're viewing from. Believe me, you'll want to watch until the conclusion because this narrative contains unexpected turns. Let's start with Rebecca Martinez, a 26-year-old officer who had dedicated her career to following each rule, protocol, and procedure exactly. She wasn't among those officers who compromised standards or ignored problems. Rebecca was unique. Her peers admired her because she showed respect to everyone, whether they were fellow officers, citizens, or suspects. She possessed this calm confidence that commanded attention when she spoke. Rebecca had always aspired to law enforcement work. Raised in a small Texas community, she observed her father work as a sheriff's deputy for more than 2 decades. He taught her that police work meant more than simply wearing a uniform. It meant protecting those unable to protect themselves. It meant serving as the boundary between disorder and stability. Most crucially, it meant maintaining your principles regardless of circumstances. Following her graduation from the police academy with highest distinction, Rebecca began working at a busy Dallas precinct. She handled traffic, violations, family disputes, robbery cases, and everything a rookie officer encounters. Her supervisors immediately recognized her potential. She was meticulous, professional, and possessed this inherent talent for calming volatile situations. Fellow officers began requesting to work alongside her because they trusted her reliability. However, Rebecca's commitment to proper procedures sometimes created conflicts with others. When she observed questionable conduct from colleagues, she documented it. When she noticed shortcuts in documentation, she voiced concerns. When supervisors attempted to influence her case handling, she remained steadfast. This earned admiration from some, but also created adversaries. The crisis occurred when her immediate supervisor, Captain Williams, began making unwelcome advances. Williams was a man in his 50s who had served the department for over 25 years. He possessed connections, power, and a history of achieving his objectives. When Rebecca courteously but firmly declined his advances, Williams reacted poorly. He began making her professional life miserable, scheduling her for the most undesirable shifts, the most hazardous calls, and continuously challenging her documentation. One night, Williams summoned Rebecca to his office. The discussion began professionally enough, but soon became personal. He made clear that her career progression depended on being more accommodating toward him. When Rebecca refused and indicated she would report his conduct, Williams smiled menacingly and warned her she was making a serious error. 2 weeks afterward, Rebecca received reassignment orders. She was being transferred to a maximum security prison facility 3 hours from Dallas. The stated reason was personnel requirements, but Rebecca understood the reality. Williams had leveraged his influence to punish her for resisting him. Rather than challenging the transfer and potentially harming her career further, Rebecca accepted it gracefully. She gathered her belongings and prepared for an entirely different type of law enforcement role. The prison facility differed completely from the police station. The instant she entered those massive steel doors, Rebecca sensed the place's oppressive weight. The atmosphere was dense with tension, the sounds were rougher, and the environment contained a constant undercurrent of danger that never disappeared. This was no longer about protecting and serving the public. This was about maintaining control in a place where hope frequently died. Rebecca's duties included overseeing inmates during daily activities, escorting them throughout the facility, and ensuring security procedures were maintained. She quickly discovered that corrections work demanded a different skill set than street policing. Here, you needed to interpret people differently comprehend the unwritten rules, and maintain authority without unnecessarily escalating situations. Most inmates fit predictable patterns. There are the hostile ones who constantly challenged authority, the defeated ones who had abandoned hope, the manipulators who attempted to exploit the system, the silent ones who simply wanted to complete their sentences and leave. Rebecca treated them all with the same professional courtesy she had shown everyone throughout her career. But after her initial month at the facility, one inmate captured her attention unexpectedly. His name was David Chun, and he differed from the others. David was completing a 15-year sentence for business fraud and theft. Unlike most inmates, he maintained quiet dignity. He was respectful to staff, supportive of fellow inmates, and never created problems. Something about him didn't match the typical profile of someone belonging in maximum security. David was in his early 30s, well-educated, and had worked as a quality assurance supervisor at a food processing corporation before his conviction. He spent most time in the prison library, reading everything available. Other inmates respected him because he helped them compose letters to families and assisted with legal documents. The guards generally appreciated him because he never caused trouble. Rebecca first observed David during meal supervision. While other inmates spoke loudly, argued, or ate silently, David would sit quietly reading a book or writing in a journal. He was always respectful when she gave directions, never attempted inappropriate conversation, and maintained proper boundaries. But something in his expression, a sorrow that seemed deeper than mere incarceration. Over several weeks, Rebecca began noticing small details about David. He would sometimes gaze through windows during yard time with a look of deep regret. When he believed no one was observing, his composed mask would slip, and she could see the anguish he carried. During mail distribution, he never received correspondence, never had visitors, and seemed completely cut off from the outside world. One evening during her patrol, Rebecca discovered David sitting alone in the common area, staring at a photograph. When he noticed her approaching, he quickly concealed it, but not before she glimpsed what appeared to be a family picture. That's when she realized that beneath his calm exterior, David was carrying a burden that extended far beyond his criminal conviction. The following day, during a routine cell search, Rebecca uncovered something that would change everything. Hidden among David's personal items, she found a carefully arranged folder containing documents, correspondence, and what seemed to be evidence related to his case. When she confronted him about it, David's response completely surprised her. He didn't deny possessing the materials. Instead, he looked directly at her and said something that would trouble her for weeks ahead. He told her he was innocent, that he had been set up by his previous employer, and that he had one final request before he completely lost hope. He needed someone outside to help him prove his innocence. But more significantly, he needed someone to fulfill a commitment he had made to his dying daughter. Rebecca stood there holding that folder, knowing that what happened next would determine not just David's future, but her own as well. That David's words struck Rebecca like a physical impact. She stood frozen in his cell, the folder shaking slightly in her grasp. Everything about this moment felt wrong, dangerous, like standing on a precipice, knowing one misstep could destroy everything she'd built. But something in David's voice, the quiet desperation combined with dignity, made her remain and listen. He told her about his daughter, Emma, who had been only 8 years old when he was arrested. Emma had been fighting leukemia, spending more time in hospital rooms than on playgrounds. During his trial, while attorneys debated financial records and corporate procedures, Emma's health had deteriorated. David had made her a commitment during one of their final visits before sentencing. He promised he would prove his innocence and return home to take her to see the ocean, something she had dreamed about but never experienced. Emma had died 6 months into his imprisonment. David never fulfilled that promise, never said goodbye properly, never showed her the waves she had only seen in picture books. The remorse was consuming him. But there was more. Emma's mother, David's former wife, had received threatening calls after the trial. Someone wanted to ensure certain information remained hidden, and David suspected his former employer was responsible. Rebecca found herself asking questions she never intended to ask. Why hadn't his attorney pursued these leads? Why hadn't the evidence been presented properly? David's responses painted a picture of a justice system that had failed him, of corporate attorneys who had outmaneuvered an overwhelmed public defender, of witnesses who had suddenly altered their testimonies or vanished completely. That night, Rebecca couldn't rest. She kept thinking about David's account, about the folder of documents, about a little girl who had died while her father sat in prison for crimes he claimed he didn't commit. She told herself this wasn't her concern, that getting involved would be professional suicide. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw David's expression when he spoke about Emma. The next morning, Rebecca made a choice that contradicted every instinct she developed as a law enforcement officer. During her lunch break, she drove to the nearest public library and began investigating David's case. What she discovered in old newspaper articles and court records made her stomach churn. The case had been rushed through the system. Key witnesses had withdrawn their testimony after the trial. The company David had worked for had been investigated for safety violations multiple times. But somehow those investigations had always been dismissed. Rebecca spent her days off digging deeper. She contacted journalists who had covered corporate crime, spoke with former employees of David's company, and slowly began assembling a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond what David had been accused of. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that David was truthful. But investigating was one thing. Acting on what she discovered was entirely different. Rebecca knew that helping an inmate in this manner could cost her not just her job, but potentially her freedom. If she was wrong about David, if this was all an elaborate manipulation, she would lose everything. But if she was correct, an innocent man was deteriorating in prison while the real criminals walked free. The breakthrough occurred 3 months into her investigation. A former company executive dying of cancer and wanting to clear his conscience contacted a reporter with evidence of the cover-up. Financial records, emails, and recordings that proved David had been framed. The executive had been pressured to falsify documents that made David appear guilty, while the real embezzlement had been orchestrated by senior management. Rebecca knew this was the moment of truth. She could take this information to the authorities through proper channels, but that would take months or years to work through the system. Or she could take a more direct approach, one that would require her to step outside her role as a corrections officer and become something she'd never been before, an advocate for justice operating in the shadows. She chose the more difficult path. Working with the journalist and the dying executive, Rebecca helped coordinate the release of the evidence to multiple news outlets simultaneously. She used her position at the prison to document David's exemplary behavior, to gather statements from other inmates about his character, and to build a case for his innocence that couldn't be ignored. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. By that evening, David's case was front-page news across Texas. The company executives who had framed him were arrested. The corrupt officials who had covered it up were under investigation. And David Shunn, who had spent 3 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit, finally had hope again. But Rebecca's involvement hadn't gone unnoticed. Prison officials launched an internal investigation into how sensitive information about David's case had been leaked. They suspected someone on the inside had been helping him, and Rebecca knew it was only a matter of time before they connected the dots back to her. The night before David's conviction was officially overturned, he asked to speak with Rebecca privately. They met in the prison chapel, a quiet space where inmates often went to find peace. David thanked her for everything she'd done, but then he made another request, one that would test Rebecca's commitment even further. He asked her to help him fulfill the promise he'd made to Emma. Not the original promise about proving his innocence, but a new one. He wanted to establish a foundation in Emma's name to help other children battling cancer, particularly those whose parents were facing legal troubles. He needed someone he trusted to help him navigate the outside world, to be his partner in building something meaningful from the ashes of his destroyed life. Rebecca looked at this man who had lost everything, his daughter, his freedom, his reputation, and yet still wanted to use his experience to help others. She realized that fulfilling David's last wish wasn't just about clearing his name or seeking justice. It was about transformation, about taking pain and turning it into purpose, about honoring the memory of a little girl who had never gotten to see the ocean as David walked out of prison as a free man the following week. Rebecca knew her own journey was just beginning. Rebecca stood at her apartment window 3 days after David's release, watching the sunrise paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and pink. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from prison administrators, internal affairs investigators, and reporters who had somehow gotten her number. She let them all go to voicemail. There were bigger things happening now, things that mattered more than protecting her career. David had called her the night before. His voice sounded different outside those prison walls, lighter somehow, but still carrying the weight of everything he'd been through. He'd found a small apartment in Houston and was slowly adjusting to freedom. But he wasn't calling to talk about himself. He wanted to move forward with the foundation they discussed, and he needed her help to make it happen. Rebecca had spent years following orders, working within systems, trusting that institutions would do the right thing. But watching David's case had taught her that sometimes the system fails, and when it does, individuals have to step up and fill the gaps. She made a decision that morning that would reshape everything about her future. She submitted her resignation from the correctional facility. Her supervisor, Warden Martinez, called her into his office that afternoon. He was a decent man who had always treated Rebecca fairly, and she could see the disappointment in his eyes as he read her resignation letter. Martinez set the letter down and looked at her directly. He told her he knew she'd been involved in the Chun case, that the investigation had found evidence of her research activities. But he also told her something she hadn't expected. He said that in 30 years of corrections work, he'd rarely seen an officer show the kind of integrity she'd demonstrated. He couldn't officially condone what she'd done, but he understood why she'd done it. Rebecca left that meeting feeling a mix of relief and terror. She was walking away from steady income, benefits, and a career path she'd worked hard to build. But she was walking towards something that felt more important than any paycheck, the chance to be part of something that could make a real difference. David met her at a coffee shop in downtown Houston the following week. It was strange seeing him in civilian clothes, sitting across from her without bars or guards or institutional protocols between them. He looked older than his 33 years, but there was something in his posture that hadn't been there in prison. Hope, maybe, or determination. They talked for hours about the foundation. David had already been in contact with several hospitals and cancer research centers. He'd spoken with lawyers about the legal requirements for establishing a nonprofit organization. But what he needed was someone who understood investigations, someone who could help identify families who needed support, someone who could navigate the complex world of law enforcement and legal systems that often left families feeling helpless and alone. Rebecca found herself saying yes before she'd fully processed what she was agreeing to. Maybe it was the way David's eyes lit up when he talked about helping other families avoid what he and Emma had gone through. Maybe it was the realization that she'd spent her entire career trying to serve justice. And this felt like the purest form of that service she'd ever encountered. They spent the next 3 months laying the groundwork. Rebecca used her savings to cover living expenses while they applied for nonprofit status, developed program guidelines, and reached out to potential donors. David threw himself into the work with an intensity that was almost frightening. He would stay up until 3 in the morning researching funding opportunities, writing grant applications, and reaching out to medical professionals who might want to partner with him. Rebecca worried about him sometimes. She could see that he was channeling all his grief about Emma into this project, and she wondered if he was dealing with his emotions in a healthy way. But she also recognized that purpose was powerful medicine, and David seemed to draw strength from the idea that his daughters Mimir would live on through their work. The Emma Chun Foundation officially launched 6 months after David's release from prison. Their first case came through a referral from a social worker at Children's Hospital. A single mother named Maria Santos was facing bankruptcy while trying to pay for her son's cancer treatments. Her ex-husband had been arrested on drug charges, leaving her to handle everything alone. She was overwhelmed by medical bills, legal paperwork, and the constant fear of losing her child. Rebecca drove to Maria's apartment on a Saturday morning, bringing groceries and a folder full of resources the foundation had compiled. She sat at Maria's kitchen table, helping her organize medical bills and insurance paperwork while 8-year-old Carlos played video games on an old tablet. The boy was thin and pale from chemotherapy, but his smile reminded Rebecca powerfully of the photographs she'd seen of Emma. That evening, Rebecca called David to update him on the visit. She could hear the emotion in his voice as she described Carlos, how he'd asked if she wanted to see his drawings, how he'd told her about wanting to be a doctor when he grew up, so he could help other sick kids. David was quiet for a long moment after she finished talking. Then he said something that made Rebecca understand the true depth of what they were doing together. He told her that for the first time since Emma died, he felt like he was keeping his promise to her. Not the original promise about proving his innocence, but a deeper one about making sure other children didn't have to face what she had faced alone. Over the following year, the foundation grew beyond what either of them had imagined possible. They helped dozens of families navigate the complex intersection of medical crises and legal troubles. They provided financial assistance for treatments, connected families with pro bono legal services, and created supper tea groups where parents could share their experiences without judgment. Rebecca discovered she had a gift for this work. Her law enforcement background helped her cut through bureaucracy and advocate effectively for families dealing with overwhelmed social services systems. Her natural empathy made her someone parents trusted with their deepest fears and most desperate needs. She found herself working longer hours than she ever had as a police officer, but feeling more fulfilled than she'd ever thought possible. David had transformed as well. The broken man she'd met in prison had become a passionate advocate who could speak to corporate executives and medical professionals with equal skill. He testified before state legislative committees about the need for better support systems for families facing medical crises. He spoke at conferences about criminal justice reform and the importance of second chances. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to both of them. The phone call from a mother whose son had completed treatment successfully, the graduation photo from a teenager who'd beaten cancer while her father served time for a mistake he'd made years earlier. The thank you letter from family who said the foundation had helped them hold on to hope when everything else seemed lost. One evening, almost exactly 2 years after David's release, Rebecca was working late at the foundation's small office when her phone rang. It was David, and his voice carried an excitement she hadn't heard before. He'd just gotten off a call with a major pharmaceutical company that wanted to partner with the foundation on a new program providing free medications for children whose families couldn't afford them. As Rebecca listened to David describe the partnership opportunity, she realized something profound had happened. They had taken the worst experiences of their lives, his wrongful imprisonment and her professional exile, and transformed them into something that was changing other people's lives for the better. David's last wish had evolved into something neither of them had imagined when they first started working together. The little girl who had never gotten to see the ocean was now helping other children navigate storms of their own. And the police officer who had risked everything to help a prisoner was discovering that sometimes the most important laws are the ones written in the human heart. But their story was far from over. Rebecca sensed that David was building towards something even bigger, something that would test both of their commitments in ways they hadn't yet imagined. That something bigger came sooner than either of them expected. 3 months later, Rebecca received a call that would test everything they had built together. It was from a detective in Dallas, someone she had worked with years earlier during her time as a police officer. Detective Rodriguez's voice was tense as he explained the situation. A major investigation had uncovered a network of corporate corruption that went far beyond David's original case. The same company that had framed David was now facing federal charges for systematically covering up safety violations that had led to serious illnesses and deaths. The investigation had revealed a pattern of targeting whistleblowers, destroying evidence, and using their legal connections to silence anyone who threatened their operations. But there was a problem. Several key witnesses had disappeared or refused to testify, terrified of the company's reach and influence. The prosecutors needed someone who understood the company's methods, one who had already proven they were willing to stand up to powerful interests. They needed David to testify, not just about his own case, but about everything he had observed during his time working there. Rebecca could hear the fear in David's voice when she called to tell him about the request. He had spent 3 years in prison because of these people. He had lost his daughter while fighting for his innocence. Now they were asking him to put himself back in the crosshairs of the same forces that had destroyed his life once before. The decision wasn't just about David's safety. If he testified, it would mean stepping away from the foundation during its most critical growth period. It would mean reliving the trauma of his conviction, facing hostile lawyers who would try to discredit him, and risking everything they had built together. But it also meant the chance to prevent other families from going through what he and Emma had endured. Rebecca found herself in a familiar position, caught between the safe choice and the right choice. She could encourage David to focus on the foundation, to protect the good work they were doing and avoid the risks of getting involved in another legal battle. Or she could support him in taking on a fight that was bigger than both of them, one that could expose a system of corruption that had destroyed countless lives. They met at the small park where David often went to think, the same park where he had scattered Emma's ashes after his release from prison. As they sat on a bench watching children play on swings and slides, Rebecca could see David wrestling with the decision. His hands were shaking slightly, and she recognized the signs of someone reliving traumatic memories. David told her about the nightmares that had started again since the detective's call. He described lying awake at night, remembering the feeling of being completely powerless as his life was systematically destroyed by people who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to their profits. He talked about the guilt he still carried over Emma's death, wondering if things might have been different if he had been more careful, more strategic in how he had tried to expose the company's wrongdoing. But then David's voice changed, becoming stronger and more determined. He told Rebecca about a conversation he'd had with Maria Santos the week before. Maria's son, Carlos, was now in remission, healthy and happy, and looking forward to starting middle school. Maria had thanked David for everything the foundation had done for her family, but she had also said something that stuck with him. She told him that the foundation's work was important, but the real gift he had given her was hope. Hope that good people still existed, that someone would fight for families like hers when they couldn't fight for themselves. David looked at Rebecca and said something that made her understand the true measure of the man she had chosen to partner with. He told her that Emma would have wanted him to fight, not just for other sick children, but for all the families who were facing powerful enemies they couldn't defeat alone. He said that testifying wasn't just about seeking justice for what had happened to him. It was about preventing future Emmachens from losing their parents to corporate greed and systematic corruption. Rebecca felt a familiar sensation, the same feeling she had experienced in David's prison cell 2 years earlier when she first decided to help him. It was the recognition that some moments define who you are, and backing down isn't really an option when you understand what's at stake. She told David she would support whatever decision he made, but she also shared her own perspective. During her years in law enforcement, she had seen too many cases where the powerful escaped consequences while ordinary people paid the price for their crimes. She had watched families destroyed by systems that were supposed to protect them. David's testimony could be the key to breaking a cycle of corruption that had been operating for years. More importantly, Rebecca reminded David of something he seemed to have forgotten in his fear. He wasn't the same man who had been railroaded 3 years earlier. He wasn't alone anymore. He had allies, resources, and a platform that could amplify his voice in ways that hadn't been possible during his original trial. The foundation had given him credibility and connections that would make it much harder for his enemies to silence him. David agreed to testify. The months leading up to the trial were intense and exhausting. Rebecca found herself serving as David's protector, advocate, and emotional support system all at once. She coordinated with federal prosecutors, helped prepare David for cross-examination, and worked with security experts to ensure his safety. She also kept the foundation running, delegating responsibilities to staff members and volunteers while maintaining the programs that families like Maria's depended on. The trial itself was a media sensation. Day after day, David sat in the witness stand describing a culture of corruption that had prioritized profits over human lives. He testified about safety reports that were buried, about employees who were fired for raising concerns, about a systematic effort to cover up evidence of dangerous practices that had sickened and killed consumers across multiple states. Rebecca watched from the gallery as David faced down the same lawyers who had destroyed his life years earlier. But this time was different. David was prepared, supported, and armed with documentation that couldn't be discredited or explained away. When the defense attorneys tried to paint him as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge, David calmly pointed to the Foundation's work and asked why someone motivated by revenge would spend his freedom helping children and families rather than pursuing personal gain. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty verdicts on all major charges, prison sentences for the executives who had orchestrated the cover-up, financial penalties that would fund victim compensation and corporate oversight for years to come. But for Rebecca, the real victory came in the weeks following the trial. Phone call from other whistleblowers who had been afraid to come forward, now emboldened by David's example. Letters from families who had lost loved ones to corporate negligence, thanking them for proving that justice was still possible. Invitation from other organizations who wanted to partner with the Foundation to expand their work to new communities and new causes. Standing in the Foundation's office 6 months after the trial, Rebecca looked at the wall where they had hung photos of all the families they had helped. Dozens of smiling children, grateful parents, success stories that had emerged from some of the darkest moments in these families' lives. In the center of the wall was a photo of Emma Chun, the little girl who had never gotten to see the ocean, but whose memory had inspired waves of change that were still spreading outward. David appeared beside her, following her gaze to Emma's photo. He was different now than he had been even a year earlier. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing he had found his purpose. He told Rebecca that he had been thinking about expanding the Foundation's work, maybe establishing chapters in other states, maybe developing new programs to address the intersection of medical crises and legal troubles in underserved communities. Rebecca smiled, recognizing the tone in David's voice. It was the same tone he had used when he first described his dream of helping other families avoid what he and Emma had experienced. But now his dreams had the weight of proven success behind them and the resources to make even bigger changes possible. As they stood there planning the future, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had started as a police officer trying to serve justice within established systems. Then she had become a corrections officer working to maintain order in a broken institution. Finally, she had found her calling as an advocate operating outside traditional structures, using her skills and experience to fight for people who had nowhere else to turn. David's last wish had been simple in concept, but profound in its implications. He had wanted someone to help him prove his innocence and honor his daughter's memory. But fulfilling that wish had required Rebecca to risk everything she had worked for, to step outside her comfort zone, and to discover capabilities she never knew she possessed. The Foundation was thriving, but Rebecca knew their work was far from finished. Every day brought new calls from families facing impossible choices, new stories of people caught between medical crises and legal troubles they couldn't navigate alone. Each case reminded her that David's original wish had evolved into something much larger, a commitment to ensuring that no family would have to face these challenges without support and advocacy. Dear viewers, sometimes fulfilling one person's last wish becomes the beginning of something that changes countless lives. Rebecca Martinez thought she was helping one innocent man clear his name and honor his daughter's memory. Instead, she discovered that true justice isn't just about following rules or working within systems. Sometimes it requires individuals to step outside their roles, take risks, and fight for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. David Chin's last wish wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about transforming pain into purpose, turning personal tragedy into a force for positive change, and ensuring that a little girl's dream of seeing the ocean would live on through the lives of other children who needed someone to fight for them. Their story reminds us that the most important promises aren't always the ones we make to the living. Sometimes they're the ones we make to memories, to principles, and to futures we may never see, but hope to make possible for others that like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.